Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is Friday, October 18th, and I'm sitting down to make one final installment in a series that I've been doing on the question of whether or not we can change our karma. So, this series started with a really fun episode that I made called Can We Change Our Karma? And so, if you want to start with that one, I recommend it. Then it evolved into a second talk where I took a look at the purpose of studying karma and the process of growing our faith by the means of studying karma. And in that second episode, I looked at 5 birth charts. In this episode, I'm going to look at the broader question about that sometimes comes up alongside of this question, which is, are there like remediating loopholes in the birth chart somewhere? Like, does the birth chart tell you how to get through or get over or, conquer some kind of difficult karma? So in order to do that, I'm going to take a look at a birth chart today from a longtime client of mine, about a 10-year-old client of mine who just passed away, actually. And so this is a unique chart because I'm going to make it somewhat anonymous here, but I had the opportunity to work with this client through a lot of ups and downs, and finally through her actual death. So that chart we'll take a look at today, asking this question: if we can change our karma, then is the answer to the problem somewhere in the birth chart itself? Now, I want to make a little aside before I dive into this birth chart and offer a few thoughts about this. First of all, the history of astrology is filled with testimonies to the effectiveness of things like remedial techniques, remedial magic, remedial help. Whether it's, you have a Saturn affliction, wear a gemstone on this finger, or you have a Venus affliction, work with this plant, or like that, right? So yes, in a sense, and karma is not that mysterious, really. We make karma much more mysterious than it is. Some people are like, oh, I've got lots of karma. It's like, you can't have more or less karma, right? Not in a general sense, because the basic definition of karma is just the reality of sentient beings in the material world making choices and the chain of reactions and outcomes, materially speaking, that come from those choices. For example, if I choose to go outside and in my boxers and start running around and dancing and screaming, like, that's going to have a different outcome and a different string of events or outcomes attached to it compared to if I go outside and rake the leaves or something. We have choices, we have free will, we have agency, but the choices that we make are material, and so they're caught up in the laws of the material universe, which create effects, outcomes. And then those outcomes we have further reactions to, and we make new choices based upon, and so on and so forth. So, first of all, when someone says, I'd like to know whether or not I can change my karma, that's why I said in the very first video of this series, yeah, like, of course you can. You're changing it all the time. Karma is nothing more than the study of your choices and what results from them. So in this sense, remedial magic in astrology, finding ways of changing the karmic patterns of your birth chart, is just as common as getting a cold and going to the doctor and testing to see if you have an infection and might need an antibiotic. Or, you have a leaky pipe somewhere in your house and you need a plumber to come and fix it. The material world is full of problems, and there's full of fixes. It's full of solutions to problems. But it goes on like this also endlessly. Similarly, I have to mention that nobody ever asks if they can remediate something in their chart that guarantees success, happiness, or some, advantage materially. No one's ever being like, well, I've got this really nice Jupiter in my career house. Is there any way I can change that so I'm not so successful? Right? Nobody has a problem with karma when they like it. It's only when they don't like it, for the most part, that they have a problem with it. At any rate, so the history of astrology is full of remediation. The problem with remediation in general that I was trying to point out in the second video, and which I'll speak about a little bit now again. The problem with remediation is that ancient astrologers, the way that they looked at the material universe in general was like, look, in this universe, like whatever's full will be empty, and then whatever is empty will again be full. And it cycles like this constantly. So if you're seeking to identify your sense of self and happiness and so forth, which is natural to us, it's actually natural for beings in this universe to seek happiness. That's a Venus function. And then also for there to be conflict and strife and trouble around the seeking out of the satiation of those desires, or the seeking of that happiness, which is Mars, competition and the potential for war and strife. So this is like basic to reality, but the ancient astrologers just said, look, whatever you get in a material sense, you have a nice dinner, eventually the effects of that nice dinner wear off. If you have, a year of plenty, there will be a year of little, right? So this wasn't a pessimistic view, right? This is, to ancient astrologers, they're trying to understand the nature of reality, and they're trying to understand the nature of who we are. It's sort of like if you're on a roller coaster that's going up and down and up and down, it's fun for a while, but then eventually you start to go like, hey, did you notice that we're going in a big circle where there's lots of ups and downs? And they start to reflect on that, and they say, okay, well, if that's the case, and if it doesn't appear that like this is going to change, right, that this can change, and if I'm on here and there's really no way out of this that I can see, and I kind of have to do it, then how do I do it? Who am I in relation to this? Especially if I suddenly have the capacity to reflect on myself as someone having this experience at all. So then the natural question for ancient astrologers became like, so is there a form of happiness, for example, that endures? Is there a sense of self that is not attached to the ups and downs? Is there a way to go through the ups and downs with equanimity so that the lows are as good as the highs and the highs are as good as the lows? And do you see what I'm saying? And so that's their inquiry. That's what they're interested in, because they're students of material nature. They're students of karma. They're students of the way that things work from nature to experience. And what they noticed was that basically, it's not that it's a sin to go seeking an antibiotic if you have a cold, right? It's not like it's a bad thing to desire happiness either. It's not a bad thing to be averse to pain. It's not about judging the ups and the downs or the roller coaster ride itself, and it's not about even judging the need for happiness and the aversion to pain. None of that is their concern. But one thing that they observed from the Stoics to the Platonists to the Hermeticists, to the Pythagoreans, to the yogis, to the Buddhists, even early Christians, I would venture to say early Christians definitely felt this way. One thing that they would say is that there's no final remediation. So if you say, well, once I get the antibiotic, then I'll be happy forever. My happiness will never go away. That's when you get into a problem. If they say, similarly though, a lot of instruction around this in ancient mystical schools that practice astrology. If you try to say, oh, well, I'm getting out of here, I want to reject the world, that's problematic too, because you can't. Like you literally just can't. Even, we're breathing, we're in the karmic world. So you can't reject it, but you also can't find your lasting sense of self or happiness in it. Right? So that's like a double bind. And ancient astrologers saw that, and they were like, yeah, remediation is fine. But when people get obsessed with manipulating karma as a way of trying to solve their problems, that's when they get into trouble. It's like if you ever saw the movie Fantasia. It starts off with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? Mickey Mouse, right? He gets the wand from or it's the hat. I don't remember. It's the wand or it's the hat or something like that from the sorcerer. And he's like, yeah, I've got this, you know. And then it becomes a total mess because what he creates takes over. It takes on a life of its own, and he is lost. So similarly, there has always been a warning in ancient astrology that, look, it's not that taking, like, my wife's an herbalist, right? I worked with ayahuasca for 10 years, for God's sake, right? It's not as though I'm a stranger to remedial magic, to intentionally working with the material circumstances of our lives and trying to improve upon them or whatever. It would be completely stupid to say otherwise. But the point is that what we're really trying to figure out is that it's not power and control over our pain. It's not power and control over pleasure, meaning I don't try to powerfully use things in order to bypass something that I don't like or to get something that I do like. But that's what everybody is doing. Think about global climate change. Why is that happening? One of the reasons that it's happening is because we have tried to take as much control as possible to create as much happiness as possible. And the byproduct of it is that it's impacting the planet, the actual place we live. The feedback of that is karma teaching us about the nature of desire and about where that selfish desire is actually taking us. And we're all a part of that. None of us are like above that lesson right now. So similarly, that's like the sorcerer with, the sorcerer's apprentice, who's got the hat on or whatever. So the point is that if we're looking at our birth chart and we're going like, oh yeah, I like this and I don't like that. And, where's the trine in my chart that can solve my problems or something like that? If we think that it's just a matter of finding loopholes or some level of magical power over the discomfort of our existential situation, we're in trouble, because that's when we start trying to use the wand, and everything that we create in the name of trying to liberate ourselves from suffering creates more suffering. Everything that we try to create in the name of peace or happiness creates more problems in time. The roller coaster is not optional. Everyone's on it as long as we're embodied. It goes up, it goes down, it goes in a big circle, and you can't get out of it, but you also don't have to be defined by its ups and downs. You don't have to be identified with it. That's why, ancient astrologers believe that we were spirit souls embodied in a body, in this particular cycle. A great circles were what they studied. Now, that's the preliminary remark that I wanted to make about remediation in general. Is remediation bad? No. If I have a sinus infection, I might need amoxicillin, right? If I'm sick, I might need a plant. This material world is filled with things that we can do to change our circumstances. The problem is if that is all we are doing. And if we think that by doing that alone, we will solve the problem of the kind of happiness we're seeking, then we're in trouble. That's the idea. So from there, the question that gets asked, the question that gets asked about birth charts, like, is there a loophole, right? For example, someone left a comment, and it was a nice comment saying, like, as astrologers, we have the ability to see this karmic stuff in a chart. The chart describes our karma, our material circumstances that we've been born into that carry over from previous choices that we've made, previous choose your own adventure plots that are shaping the new circumstances of this life. Then isn't there some responsibility that we should have to helping our clients or other people, get out of the difficult karma? Like, shouldn't there be an answer like, yeah, just use your trine from this planet to that planet? Or sometimes it's like, this planet is the real problem. Just go over and do this other planet more, and then, you won't fall into the trap of that other planet. Ancient astrologers didn't speak like this. This was not this was not their vocabulary. So the simplest answer is that the remedy for bad karma is mostly the same. The way that we really want to transmute the lows on the roller coaster is mostly about embodying the perennial spiritual virtues that all traditions teach us: peace, patience, tolerance, humility, love, forgiveness. Those are things that when we embody those virtues, and oftentimes we need different kinds of spiritual practices and a spiritual lifestyle and even spiritual community in order to embody those things. So it's work. But when we embody those things, first of all, we have a way of going through anything in our chart from the kind of standpoint that we're usually looking for. When we're peaceful and content, when we're in love, when we are in our hearts, then it doesn't really matter, what's happening, which part of your birth chart is taking place. If it's a difficult transit and you're practicing the art of forgiveness in your life, that's the remediation. Right? If you're practicing patience and love, curiosity, and taking an active interest in things, not judging them and reacting to them, that's the answer. It's not that there's a trine in your chart that gives you that. The trine could be just as much the problem in your chart. The square could be just as much the answer. Depends on what day it is and what kind of consciousness you're embodying. Because the field of karma that we're living in is it's like a house surrounded, on a 10-acre plot that has its own little ecosystem. That ecosystem is alive and it's moving. You are not your chart. You are the conscious entity, and the chart is the kshetra. The chart is the field of your living karma. You're walking through it. It starts with your own body, with your own face, with your vital force. It's all of your material encasing. But it's also things like your family. It's things like your job. It's things like your psychological dispositions. But you are always the free agent in there with free will, acting and responding to those circumstances. The answer to the difficult circumstances is not found in the chart. It's found in how you respond to anything in the chart. If you get identified with the good, you can become arrogant. If you get identified with the bad, you can become a victim. Both can keep you out of the kind of contentment and peace that will really bring the kind of happiness that most of us, are looking for. So my general response is no, it's not. You don't go looking for the answer in your birth chart. You are the answer, right? It's your heart that's the answer. It's your soul that's the answer. And it's how you choose to walk through your life, responding to the circumstances of destiny. Now, some people will say, yeah, that's fine, but there are sometimes really difficult circumstances. Yeah, there are. And but you also have to see, we also have to see ourselves as eternal spiritual beings. There's no rush. It feels like impending doom when we're living with incredibly difficult things. I'll give you an example. Some of you know this. This summer, I had to pass a kidney stone. It took over a month to pass. And this was Saturn opposing my sun. So I've never felt such excruciating pain in my life. I've spoken to a number of women in my life who I trust, who are dear to me, who have also had kidney stones, who said it was more painful than contractions in labor. I don't know if that's true or not, but I can tell you that that was the most excruciating pain that I've ever had. And it came and went randomly for like a month before it finally passed. And during that experience, I had a lot of opportunity to reflect on pain. Everyone experiences pain in different degrees at different times according to their karma. And this is, this is how the material world works. Doesn't always seem fair. We don't always understand it, but that's how it goes. So when we're in the midst of pain, the point is, and I'm sure you can relate given whatever you've lived through, we come to realize in prolonged states of suffering that how we suffer matters, right? When you realize that you don't have a choice and that there is something extremely prohibiting and you have to live with it. People who have struggled with all different kinds of disabilities and hardships in life, imprisonment, people who have lost their limbs, people who have had intense tragedies occur. What do they tell us is the most important thing? They say it's how you respond to the suffering that matters. It's by grace, perhaps, that we're able to do so. I don't pretend that I suffered well with my kidney stone, but I had moments of suffering well, and they were choices that I had to make. And and sometimes the experience of suffering is purifying, and it's not about, you don't even get the choice really to suffer well. It's just suffering. But what comes out of that, usually for people, if they live out the other side and have any semblance of happiness or peace or, some good spirit, is that they don't judge suffering any longer. It's a respect for its reality. It's not a respect for its reality that's cold-hearted and that wants people to be detached from suffering either. It's not like, oh, well, suffering just is, get used to it. That's not it either. If you've suffered, you know how incredibly painful suffering is and how callous it would be to take that view towards suffering. Suffering engenders compassion, but compassion is not judgmental. That's the main thing about compassion. Compassion is not a judgmental mode of consciousness. So in that sense, when it comes to living through astrological transits or birth charts or karma or whatever, the main thing we have to remember is that you are not your good accomplishments or your good karma, your heavenly experiences, any more than you are your hellish experiences. You are the meeting ground, the circulating place where both heaven and hell, vacillate. You are the seer here. You're the spirit soul in which the field of your karma manifests because of choices that you've made and because of choices that you'll continue to make. So then the question becomes about, basically then, so can we change our karma? Yes. Is there a loophole in the chart somewhere? No. The loophole is you, right? You're the trine. Do you know what I mean? Like so it's us. It's each one of us trying to live with heart that is the remediation finally. Now that doesn't mean that you can't study the chart and, get into remedial techniques, for example. And I'm not as much a fan of those techniques that focus on, go to this area of your birth chart. It's always felt to me very abstract and dissociative. What strikes me as really interesting, for example, is medical astrology married to herbalism, something my wife and I have been doing for a long time and will be doing more of in the coming months and year, where someone's really struggling with something and they say, help, I need some help here because I'm really struggling with this thing and it's a perpetual pain and I just need some help to get through it. There's no problem with that. Are you going to shame someone for asking for help? In which case there's all sorts of healing methods and techniques that you can look at and say, okay, you've got an out of whack, Saturn in this house or whatever, try this herb, try this diet, So, but right, what we are saying is that if a person thought, yeah, I just need to get over this chronic immune system problem that I'm having. And then, once I'm over that, then I'll be fine. I'll be happy. Once my physical body is fine, then I'll be happy. No, because you'll keep according to ancient astrology, you'll keep living lives, and eventually, you'll have another problem like that. And eventually your soul will get worn down by, wearied by, its intelligence will start to raise the red flag and be like, wait a second. Even if my immune system gets better, even if the rocky karmic circumstances get better, the benefits or happiness that I receive, materially speaking, it doesn't last forever. Some other thing comes back, and then I got to deal with it again. And I'm starting to wonder if there's something more than this, because it feels like a cycle that's very maddening. Like Einstein, who said, insanity, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, trying to get a different result. So, it's a different thing when you're looking for help, but very well it's not going to solve all your problems. It's not going to make problems themselves go away in this material world. And it's a completely different, that's vastly different. And you get a different result than when it's like people who petition God when they're freaked out by something. Okay, God, I swear to God, I'll just be like, my whole life will be dedicated to you. You just help me out of this jam. And then as soon as they're out of the jam, they're like, I don't even know if I believe any of that stuff. Right? That's the problem that we're talking about. That's what we're getting at around. Don't go looking for loopholes in the birth chart. Don't try to figure out some way that the birth chart can solve your problem. You're the answer, and you're not your birth chart. Your birth chart is a description of your karmic field. Now, the description, people say, wait a second though, I don't want this to be some kind of dry, detached karmic science. You know what I mean? Like I go to the birth chart for inspiration. I go to the birth chart for motivation. I go to the birth chart for healing. Isn't that in there too? You're telling me it's just this dead, dry, detached karmic science. No, that's not what we're saying at all. If you go back and listen to what I said in the first 2 talks of this series, I'll say it again now. The language of astrology is so helpful because it turns out that there is something more than this roller coaster ride. There is something more than it, and it exists in a plane of reality that is a plane of reality that is on the level of consciousness. It's not bound by material circumstance and material physical laws. It's free from that. And this is why when we access this level of consciousness, sometimes the highs are the lows and the lows are the highs. Things get flipped on their head. That's why if you listen to a talk I gave not long ago, I talked about how Jupiter in many ways defines our daytime sense of happiness, order, sanity. And Pluto actually is the underworld brother of Zeus, who flips that on its head at times and shows us how perverse and crazy that idea of happiness really is. And it introduces us to the idea that things that look really hellish are actually very rich and blissful. For example, if you've ever worked out and gone through the pain of, really working out and get a deep sweat going, right? Feels like hell when you're in it. And then you break through. And that breakthrough where suddenly the fire of your workout, the fire of Hades, becomes blissful. That's Pluto's perspective. And it shatters the normal operating paradigm of happiness and order that we tend to live with. So this is like these kinds of ideas are really common in ancient astrology. It's the reason that it is not a dry karmic science is specifically because deep within the fibers of the language is the ability to understand the dance of eternity as it's playing out. Like, this is why Plato again said that time is the moving image of eternity. This language is a way of poeticizing what otherwise at times feels like a maniacal, endless, circular roller coaster ride. This language poeticizes it, gives it depth, makes the highs into hells and makes the hells into heavens. It has the power to start bridging us into the eternal spiritual nature that we are and that we are a part of. It helps us to see God in everything. It helps us to see God in one another. It helps us to see God in nature. It helps us to see God in pain. It helps us to see, everything. There's a Thich Nhat Hanh quote I read not long ago, and he was talking about if we walk with anxiety on the earth, we're creating an anxious earth, something to that effect. When we walk and we don't realize that we're walking on God, right? It's simple. When we look at a tree and we don't realize I'm looking at God, right? That's the bankruptcy of the heart. That's our poorness. That's where we're really poor and we're ignorant and we're in the dark. We don't see it, And so the language of astrology is about saying, oh, you're going through this kind of experience. Let me take that experience and bring it into the mythic realm of Hades, or the mythic realm of Kronos, or the mythic realm of Aphrodite, the gods who participate in the Leela. They are thought of by ancient astrologers as the ambassadors of Godhead, of the supreme, the ineffable, the great mystery. But this world, this roller coaster ride, if we start to see the patterns, the ups and the downs from this perspective, from the use of this language, it's poetic, it's deep, it's soulful, it's soul making, it's heart opening. It helps us see God in everything, and that's where the love comes in, and that's what liberates. That's the loophole. But it doesn't happen anywhere else but in you or in me. That's a choice we have to make. And it's a practice. You don't just choose one day to see it that way because it's a nice idea. People who really deeply believe this, you think of people like Thomas Merton, who's one of my favorite Christian monks. Think of people like, Thich Nhat Hanh, and what are they doing with their lives? In order to see this way, in order to experience this way, the mindful walking that he does, the mindful eating that he does, the rhythm of life that Thich Nhat Hanh embodies and teaches to his students at Plum Village. The monastic way of life is not set aside, though, for, just great mystics who sit in caves somewhere. It's meant for all of us, right? It's meant for any of us. It starts with really, really simple choices that have nothing to do with the trines in your birth chart or the squares. It's really, really simple things like, do you get enough sleep? Do you drink enough water? Do you keep the crap out of your system? Do you spend time like non-goal oriented work related time? Do you turn off your phone? Do you listen to peaceful music? Do you journal and talk to God in your notes and your thoughts? Do you walk with the wind? Do you know what I mean? It's a deeply romantic path to fall in love with the universe, to fall in love with your life, your inner workings, to develop an inner voice of forgiveness and compassion. But that work is not something that the birth chart says, oh, just go here and do this and do that or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to say that that the birth chart isn't. So the birth chart is filled with all of the language that we need to help us reframe and make the healthy choice, to reframe and keep the heart open. The language is there to take us back to God, to take us back to divinity or spirit or the universe, whatever your word you may be comfortable with. But the language is there to help us do that. The birth chart is there to help us see the field of our changing experiences as God. The problem is that we should judge any of the experiences, the good or the bad. You know what I mean? And the problem is that the even more basic problem is that we should look on the birth chart and look on our lives and say, well, my happiness is going to be defined by some kind of outcome that I get or don't get, some kind of pattern or problem that I'm dealing with or not dealing with. Again, one of the core traits of starting to remediate the effects of karma is that ancient astrologers talk about is a change of heart and a change of mind with regard to the nature of suffering. It's deeply difficult to love suffering. I am not at all trying to make it sound easy. I am not at all trying to promote a detached view. Just be detached to suffering. No, that's not the answer. The answer is to love suffering, to be compassionate. I don't know about you, but I find that to be the most challenging thing in the world. And yet I've had tastes of it. I've had glimpses of it. I know that I can do it. I know you can do it. I know that that is the right thing. I know in my heart, and I'm not giving up. Like, that's what my faith is that is the thing worth living for. It's compassion, forgiveness, peace, love, to love everything. It sounds so grandiose saying it compared to how poor I am at doing it. How poor in spirit and in heart we all are when it comes to this. It's a knock to the ego to have to accept that we're poor in spirit, that we're poor in heart, that we have such a hard time loving and accepting and surrendering to this world that we're in. It's a really deeply difficult thing to be humble and to say, yeah, I keep banging my head on the same wall, trying to seek happiness for myself in ways that don't fulfill me, that are a bit more, are selfish, right? And it's even harder is that if we try to do that, oftentimes, if we try to hold ourselves accountable to love, we do so in a legalistic way, in a cold, detached, legalistic way. Start flagellating ourselves on the back, like, oh, you're not loving, you're not accepting, you're not, you're so attached to your karma, you're so attached to this world. Beat ourselves on the back, right? That's not it either. That's the detachment doesn't work. Because you will not, your heart and soul are love. So you will not stop seeking it. You will not stop seeking to consummate love with others, with reality, with God, with everything else that is also love. We're looking for what's real. And so we can't get there by chastising ourselves because we're not there. We can't also ignore that that's where we need to go. That is the cross of matter. That's why ancient astrologers defined matter as a cross. That's why the Christian symbolism uses the cross. Those are the stakes of the game, And what a beautiful game it is, right? Like, it's not like, I always say this to people. People are like, well, it seems really punitive, like, oh, this material world is so bad, whatever. Don't think about it, like, right? Like, this divine intelligence has provided us with this entire situation, a situation where we can go neck deep into Maya, into samsara, neck deep into karma, and just go for it. Have tons of experiences, seek out all different kinds of pleasure and all different kinds of experiences that don't work. It's not condemning us for doing that. It's facilitating that for us. It's not saying, oh, you shitty person, look at you, want to go and explore all of this stuff. No, it's in the Shastras, Maya, the realm of samsara, is a servant of God. That's how Maya is talked about. So Maya, the word Maya, also means mercy. The experiences that we want to have in this world, we don't chastise ourselves for wanting to have them. We don't beat ourselves up for wanting to have them. And we don't think that God is mad at us or punishing us or something like that. It's not a punitive thing. No, if we want, with our free will, if we want to go and experience these things, we can endlessly. And it's facilitated for us to experience those things. However, built into the experiences and the outcomes of those choices is both heaven and hell, right? And it gets to be a roller coaster ride. And when you loop back and forth between them long enough, at some point people say, okay, I have a question, right? Like, I'm a jiva, I'm a little soul. I've been doing all sorts of crazy stuff. Let me tell you about Nebula 9 over there. That was a crazy place. You know what I mean? Like that. And all facilitated by the most amazing craftsmen ever, right? This kind of thing. So, and then we say, but I do have a question. None of this is really doing it for me. Some souls are like, well, it's doing it for me. I'm fine. I'm going to keep going around the ride because it's awesome, right? And we're like, okay, that's cool. God lets people do that. Free will. Another person comes along, the Jiva and the little soul, and says, you know what? I wonder if there's something more. I wonder if there is a different use of my free will. I wonder what this is. I wonder if it's all there is. I'm not complaining. I'm just wondering. Right? At that point, all of the ancient mystic traditions tell us in one way or another, that's when your spiritual path begins. That's when you start to, languages like astrology start to show up in your path. And you start to go, okay, now I'm starting to see that the highs aren't really the point and the lows aren't really evil either. There's something more than good or evil or heaven or hell going on here, right? You start to see God in everything. You start and you start to move into a transcendental experience of everything. And it happens very, very slowly because we're just learning. You know, it's like a star nursery that we're a part of. Do we look at our children and say, oh, you know, like, you don't know how to use your fork yet, you're an idiot? Do you know what I mean? Like, so God's not doing that to us either. And if we want to just play around with our food and like jam it in our hair or whatever, like, it's not like God doesn't derive any love or humor from that. God's love is endless. God's love is unconditional. He's totally fine with us jamming food in our hair for a really long time. That's what we want to do. But, you know, again, there is a point where a soul will say, I don't think that this roller coaster ride is doing it for me any longer. I'd like to know about eternal happiness. And I wonder if I'm something more than just a body who's going to die someday. I wonder if I am a part of something bigger. Right? All these questions come up. As rare to take on a form of life in the universe that can ask these questions as popping up in the middle of a vast ocean and coming up through a life preserver. The evolutionary conditions of coming up in this kind of consciousness is exceedingly rare, according to the most brilliant of our mystics on the planet, even still today. The Dalai Lama still teaches this today. And yet, we're offended by the idea that I should or could be asking about happiness of a different order than all of the material stuff I'm invested in. We get offended by it. We get like, it's my choice. Like, I'm playing my avatar game right now. Like, don't bother me. Plato said that when people try to suggest that there is something different, that there's a different path, because out of compassion, people who have become enlightened to a different kind of way of living feel compassion for those who are suffering and go back and try to say, hey, come out of the cave. Like, there's sunlight. You would not believe this. It's different. Like, you're stressing about your bank account. I promise you that even though there's a reality to that, there's something more too. I promise. People can't trust that. They get offended by it. They get really offended by it. Oh, you're going to tell me that my pain and suffering isn't real? Or you're going to tell me that my goals are meaningless? You're going to tell me that my abilities and my talents aren't great? You're going to tell me that, you know, I should live in a cave? Do you know what I mean? People get pissed. I know because I got pissed when these things entered my life. That's how I know. And that's why I can have compassion, and I still do. My wife could call me out on something tonight and I'd get pissed off about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, because we're, in many ways, we just have a poor fund of heart mojo. We're working on it. You know what I mean? And God's really patient with us. So we should be really patient with ourselves too. We should be really patient with life. This is not a cold, dry, cut off, detached, analytical science. It's helping us to transcendentalize the roller coaster ride. It's helping us to make sure that we don't become the sorcerer's apprentice, playing with powers we pretend to understand, thinking it will get me happiness, and oftentimes it only complicates things. So but I will say that when you learn this kind of karmic science, ancient astrology in particular is in many ways fundamentally different from modern astrology. I am not condemning modern astrology either. There are many modern astrologers and forms of modern astrology that are very wise and have the same game plan that I'm talking about, right? And when I talk about modern astrology, I'm usually talking about really sort of generic pop modern astrology. And one of the defining features of modern astrology is sometimes to be like let's look for everything that's materially positive in your chart. You're a good person, you're a healer, you're a level 10 shaman, you're right, like all of that. And let's sympathize with how bad you've had it and how far you've come. Oh, you had a rough dad, and but look at how strong you are, and like all of this. And also there is a way of trying to make everything very, very bright and very positive. And of course, there's nothing wrong with positivity, right? But remember, the opposite of Saturn is Jupiter, and the opposite of, Jupiter is Saturn. So if we can use ancient astrology with a degree of optimism, faith, and heart, then I don't think it has to be a dry, detached karmic science at all. That's my 2 cents. Now, only a couple more things I'm going to say, and then I want to show you a chart. So modern astrology will often be like really promoting conflation of your sense of self with your chart. I'm a Virgo. I'm a Mars in the 10th house. I'm a this, my that. Conventionally, I use this kind of stuff myself. So I'm not like, some kind of, fundamentalist about not using that language. It's fine. But what I try to get across is that when it comes to being identified with your birth chart, and when it comes to then trying to seek the answers to problems in your birth chart, that entire paradigm, if we promote it too much, is problematic. It's problematic because the practice of love, the practice of building loving communion with others, seeing God in everything, that path is really not, in my experience and my observation, it's not found in that approach. It's not found in getting more identified with, pop descriptions of your character, personality, or karma, and wearing them like your avatar outfit. Even though you will, because our psychology is wrapped up in this language and so forth. So, but we have to, my point is that we have to wear it very lightly. Be careful about thinking that the answer is in the avatar outfit and manipulations of avatar costume apparel. We have to just be very careful about that. Now, I like to push in this direction because the countervailing tendency is so strong. So I push in this direction, not because I don't see anything good in modern astrology, not because I don't think that there is healing and love and light in modern astrology. It's because one of the things that I observe day in and day out, 1,000 clients a year for 10 years, something like that. What I see in my clients and their perception and understanding of astrology, many of my clients, most of them are not like real deep students of astrology. They're people who come to astrology trusting that it has something truthful and good and helpful to offer. But one of the things that I see over and over and over again, day in and day out, is I am defined by my chart. My happiness is defined by my chart. And the answers to my pain are somehow in my chart, right? A lot of anxiety wrapped up in conflation of identity with the birth chart. So the karmic science standpoint of ancient astrology is a push in the opposite direction. It's a push saying, you're not your chart, and let's be a little bit more objective. Let's gain just a little bit more distance not cold, detached distance. And then if we pair that distance with this poetic singing of the reality of karma, not just, well, you're going to have a Saturn transit and it's going to suck, right? But if someone's going to have a Saturn transit, then let's talk about it from this, let's deepen the experience for somebody so that they can start to see divinity in everything. So it's a combination of being a little bit more objective, but also helping people understand. See, in the ancient world, people didn't need us to be deeply poetic about things because the gods were real to them. We are now poetic about them and literary about them and metaphorical and mythical about them because we think that they are metaphors and myths. We don't think that they're real. And so the language of astrology is supposed to be this way of making our experiences more artistic, more meaningful, right? But actually, it's the reality of the gods moving in the sky and their hand in your life. Like in the ancient world, if you broke a bone, it was much easier to have a spiritual experience of breaking your bone because you're literally thinking about Saturn in your broken bone. There's a god there, right? Nowadays, we're trying to recreate that a lot of the times in modern astrology. When ancient astrology comes along and seems more prescriptive and like, oh, well, they were so unevolved. It's like, no, actually not at all. If they talked about the gods doing something in your life, it might seem unattached or detached, but can you imagine how personal and powerful and mystical that would be if you believed down to your bone that the gods were real? Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not, ancient astrology was not a detached karmic science. It promoted a transcendental understanding of reality and of experience, of the gods in our experiences. It appears more detached and more objective in many ways because those texts take for granted that most of the population lives with the reality of the gods in a much more magical, what we would call a more magical, spiritualized understanding of reality itself, which has been stripped from us now. So, unfortunately, one of the weird things that happens is modern astrology is I'll make this claim, this is kind of a radical claim, but I would say that in many ways, if you're someone who already takes the reality of the gods very seriously, then ancient astrology is awesome for you. If you believe that they exist and you're fine with them having these very powerful roles to play in the administration of karma in the universe, and you can feel their reality personally, ancient astrology is not an objective cold science. It's freaking powerful and amazing and divine. On the other hand, this is a little bit of a provocative statement, but on the other hand, if you're someone who thinks of gods and spiritual forces and powers and so forth in terms of literary, archetypal, philosophical, psychological, mental constructs, right? Well, who's the cold, detached one? And I'm not saying everyone's like this, but a lot of modern astrologers are actually people who are completely agnostic, or they have no faith commitment really, or they're not people who are invested in the reality of divinity, of gods and spirits, right? Of soul, of the reality of souls. They're not living in a magical universe. They're living in a literary, metaphorical, intellectual ivory tower that says, astrology is just this great language of psychology. But we're living in the modern world where we don't have to believe in gods. These are literary, mythical constructs or whatever. So sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes modern astrology is actually the one that's cold, detached, overly rational, etc. Plus, sometimes if you pair it with the investment that it has in getting us identified with our birth chart and thinking we can manipulate our birth chart like it's some kind of mental wiring system, that we just change our behavior and then we pull the slot machine and we get a different material experience. Like that's actually mechanical, cold, dry, rational, and detached. So I want to flip that on its head a minute, but ultimately, whether you're practicing modern astrology or ancient astrology, if you are practicing it from the standpoint of helping people to be liberated in love, to see divinity in everything, then I believe it doesn't really matter what form of astrology you're practicing. You know what I mean? There's a lot of medicines out there. So there's a lot of languages out there that are built to help us transcendentalize and open our hearts to love. So it's not actually about ancient versus modern astrology. The reason I gravitated towards ancient astrology was that I greatly appreciated a system that had a little bit more efficiency, organization, accuracy, internal cohesion, repeatability when it comes to the prediction of karmic sequences of events, or I appreciate that objectivity because it, for me, has really helped people over time in the way that I've used it, which hopefully has been with some degree of compassion and love, and hopefully some poetic nuance. I have seen people able to move with greater equanimity through the ups and downs of life. If we teach people that the science of karma is the science of divinity, and it's all sacred and it's all beautiful, and we can embody that in the way that we use the karmic science, it's not a cold, dry, detached thing. So I try to do that. But, if you're someone who's, you're like watching my channel, you're like, well, this feels cold, dry, and detached, or whatever. Remember that, there is such a thing as the psychology of religion. Each one of us have different teachers, different guides, different channels, different music that we like that helps open us up to that experience. I'm more concerned that people find the channel that helps them open up to that experience than I am that people sign up for Hellenistic astrology or the Adam show or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So that's the ultimate, so it's, some teachers of ancient astrology will be cold and detached because some people practice ancient astrology because they have more of a cold, detached personality, and they're not moving into it from the standpoint of spiritual practice. They're not taking seriously the metaphysical message of the ancient astrologers. They're being like, well, I like the techniques. Well, I like the, it's very objective. It's very accurate. I like the system. You know what I mean? It's like, it's no different than people who go to a yoga studio and they're like, well, I like the techniques. I like the practice. Makes me feel good and I look good in tights. Do you know what I mean? So people are using ancient astrology in that way. People can use any modern or ancient astrology. People can use it for things that are absolutely not a part of the spiritual path of astrology. Okay, now as promised, after a longish talk here, I want to talk about a birth chart. So now I'm going to share with you this birth chart, which is the chart of a client. This is a client that I had over the course of the last 10 years who just passed away. And here's what I want to highlight. When I first got together with this client, and Saturn was transiting their 7th house, they came to see me because their spouse died. So we have Saturn transiting through the 7th house of marriage and close to the ingress of Saturn into the sign of Libra. In this individual's 7th house of marriage, their partner died. It was a rough time. Now, in ancient astrology, we know that the condition of Saturn in any birth chart will tell us about the kind of karma that is involved. So, for example, in this chart, we take the natal context of Saturn into consideration first, and we see that Saturn is in the 4th house of home, family, roots, foundation, property, and is debilitated in that sign in its exile and in a nighttime chart, which means that it is the malefic contrary to the sect in favor. That's a very difficult Saturn. Now, we look at the moon, who is the dispositor or host, and we see that it is in the 7th house of marriage. So also we can see that Saturn and the moon are in a square with one another. So we know that some of the difficult karma will have to do with marriage and with family in a very basic way. I'm just keeping this really simple. We know that there are going to be difficult experiences as Saturn, when there are Saturnine seasons in this person's life. We know because they're born with a difficult Saturn-Moon combination that the topic of marriage can become, marriage or home or family can become very difficult. So Saturn ingresses into the 7th house and starts activating this natal karma. As it does so, the native's spouse died. And so the first session was not a session to sit back and go like, well, this is your detached karma about the death of your husband. No, the first session was not predictive at all. It was descriptive. She came in and said to me, my husband just died. I need to make some sense of this. And so what did we do? We talked about Saturn. And I helped her to see Saturn in the midst of the pain and suffering. Hopefully. She ended up sticking with me for 10 years, so I think we probably did a good job. It's always a joint effort, a conversation between two people that creates understanding. So we did it together. We created a feeling of Saturn. We sanctified the pain, the loss. We didn't say, oh, you have bad karma, right? Oh, you have bad karma. It's just the opposite of, I really, really want good karma. You have karma, good and bad. Let's talk about a painful experience that you had, and let's understand Saturn. Let's talk about the light and dark of Saturn. Let's move into the human experience of Saturn. Just a feature of this roller coaster ride. It's a feature of God. So we did. Now, we talked about in that first session, we talked about what the pain and the grieving was going to look like as Saturn worked through her 7th house over a couple of years. Then, as Saturn moved into her 8th house, we talked about a process that was taking place for quite a long time around the home and property that she had been left with. She, after he had died, she was left with a big house all by herself and was having a very hard time keeping up with it. He was a handyman. He did a lot of things around the house. It was hard for her to keep up with all of it. And she was in the process of trying to sell it and let go of it. So you have Saturn, Lord of Karma, in the 8th house of debts, of other people's money or spouse's assets or resources. And she was going through a very painful process of trying to say goodbye to the house and trying to manage it without his help and trying to sell it, but being unsuccessful. So prior to that happening, we were able to discuss what Saturn in the 8th house experiences can be like. And then every time we met, we talked about the difficulty of Saturn in the 8th house when it came to selling the house, right? When it came to taking the burden off of letting go of their old house together. That was most of her Saturn in the 8th house experience. And that became a focus of our Saturn talk. Now, at the tail end of that experience, as that experience was sort of culminating, she ended up selling the house. At which point, Saturn moves into Sagittarius in the 9th house. And because, as you can, one of the things that you can see here that's kind of neat is, when Saturn's dispositor, the moon, is in the 7th house, it's also with Jupiter. So you kind of have to take this as a moon-Jupiter dispositor. They're like sticky tape. So Saturn is disposed of by the moon, who's sticky taped to Jupiter, right? Jupiter's the ruler of the 9th house. One of the things that her and her husband shared together that was very important to them was their faith, their religious and spiritual life. Very, very important. It was when Saturn moved into the 9th house that she began going through a process of trying to, for the first time since he died, return to her faith life and sort through the pain of that loss on the level of her faith. Up until that point, even though astrology is present in her life, church was not. Her relationship with God was more challenging. So Saturn's working through that house. We're talking about faith. We're talking about doubt. Can you imagine if you're a person of faith and somehow you're okay with seeing an astrologer as well, which is not as uncommon as you would think, that you hear someone say, doubt is also a manifestation or an expression of God. This too, right? So many times Saturn is the scapegoat. Saturn is the planet that we want to pin on the person who doesn't belong or the thing that should be cast out. That's why Saturn also represents the recognition of unhappiness as the precursor to deeper spiritual happiness. Nothing can be excluded from the view of God. If we want to see God in everything, it really means everything. So we talked a lot about doubt during those years. Now, finally, Saturn came into her 10th house. And predictively, one of the things that I said was, I want you to be really careful about your health. Why? Because now Saturn's moving into an opposition with Mars, who is in its fall in Cancer and rules the ascendant, who is the planetary ruler of health and vitality. Saturn is also moving into squares with the sun and the moon. The lights, also sources of vitality. So I said we want to be really careful about your health. You're in a more vulnerable space health-wise. So she talked about doing more yoga and keeping fit. And her faith is doing better at this point in her life. But a lot of what we talked about also had to do with different kinds of things she was involved with professionally and different kinds of feelings of disillusionment she was having with different organizations that she took part in retirement. And the thing about health was in the periphery. It was something that I mentioned early on and that I would kind of check up with her on, but it was not like the thing. We talked also a lot at this point about she was in her own new place that was smaller. It was like a condo. And we talked about her getting used to being alone and living alone. And that was part of it as well. So this was someone who I spent, 10 years with. And recently, as Saturn just pulled back into the opposition with Mars, her health house ruler, she died suddenly, of a stroke. Let's see, 45, 55, 65, 75, 85, 95, 2005, 2015, 70 something, 74, something like that. 74 years old, not so old. Thought she had a lot of life in front of her. I did too. But I'm confident that the momentum of Saturn through these houses that I had the chance to spend some time with her on, I'm confident that the momentum of talking about and working into the reality of pain, suffering, doubt, loss, grief, readjusting to faith, I'm confident that the experience of astrology in her life is continuing to help her build that beautiful bridge. It's helping her stock the account of her heart. So I trust that wherever her next incarnation is, wherever she's off to next, if she takes another body, I trust that these experiences were like little seeds of helping her to understand that my happiness is not about whether he lives or dies, whether I have my faith or not, I'm going to church on Sunday or not, or my happiness is not dependent upon whether I can sell the house or not. You know what I mean? You watch enough time pass in our own lives and other people's lives. The things we're worried about go away and then new anxieties come. If we keep learning to use the language of astrology to see God in everything, that's the loophole. That's the remediation. And it takes time. It takes lifetimes. There's a famous Indian scripture I'll end with, where there was a devotee of God. And the devotee did something karmically that set him back, right? And it was like, well, you made that choice. So, now you've got to go through some material experiences for a while. And he says like, well, how long? Actually, there's two guys. There's two guys. One devotee, they both make a mistake. And the one guy says like, well, how long will I be set back? And he goes, 10 million lifetimes, 10 million more lifetimes. And the guy, just becomes crushed. And he's like, I quit. And the other devotee who is sitting there thinking, I can't believe that I did that and may have disappointed or in some ways dropped out of loving connection. I'm so bummed that happened, that I stepped out of love, not at all thinking how many lifetimes more will I have to go through, will I have to endure or whatever. When he hears 10 million lifetimes, he's like, oh, thank God, that's nothing. That's nothing. This is the perspective ultimately that we're trying to take on. 10 million lifetimes, drop in the bucket, right? Because our goal is not about a personal goal of liberation. The goal is about love. And if it breaks our heart that we come out of love, that's love too. And that's what makes 10 million years go like that. That's what makes any material experience heavenly. It's that attitude. When we mess up, when we fall out of love, if it breaks our heart, that's when our heart is, you're going in the right direction. If your heart breaks because you mess up, your heart is still open. And that's what starts bridging everything. Nothing is out of sight in that sense. So I wanted to offer this series because, again, the question that I received was very profound. And then every day that I've been doing this series, I've received more and more questions and feedback and interesting conversations. So I hope that this has been useful. Also, like I said, very transparently, I am teaching a class in ancient astrology. If you want to learn more about this spiritual path and about this astrological path, my next class starts on November 16th. I hope you'll come check it out. It's a year-long class. It's a commitment, but getting this language like uploaded into your system is amazing. Having the karmic map with you is beautiful. It's not just a dry, detached map. It's a poetic, living, beautiful, speaking, talking map. It's a singing bowl of a map, right? So come study with me if you're into it. November 16th. You can check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com, on the certification course tab. I know that this series has not been for everyone. If you stuck with it, you might be like, you know what? I really like your forecasts more, where you just shut up about all of this and stick to telling me what's going to happen with the Mars opposition or whatever. I get it. I don't do these all that often. Last year, I did an 11-part series on the Hermetica. Occasionally, I try to throw some stuff in that's just the deeper, sermons from the stars. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be back soon with more forecasting. Take care. Bye.